Welcome to Talk 26 in our series where I'm reflecting on God's goodness to me throughout my life. Most of what I've said about our years at Mattersey so far has related to what happened on the campus, and that was certainly where we spent most of our time. But our ministry was by no means confined to the campus. It was becoming increasingly international and interdenominational. So in this talk, I'll begin by describing some of my activities within Britain which took place beyond the college campus before proceeding to our travels in Europe and further afield. Beginning then with activities in Britain. Apart from my regular preaching in local churches around the country, my main activities in Britain during this centred around the Assemblies of God Executive Council, my relationships with the charismatic renewal, and expanding my writing ministry. I've already mentioned some of the positions I had held within AoG before becoming principal of the Bible College, but in 1984 I was elected to the Executive Council. This was important because it meant that the college had a voice at national level, and that I could ensure that the interests of the college were always taken into consideration. And it became even more relevant when in 1987 I became its chairman, a position I held until 2007, when the structure of AoG was radically changed, and about which I shall say more in a later talk. Since its inception in 1924, the final authority in Assemblies of God was the General Council, which met annually at the General Conference. The role of the executive was to take responsibility between conferences for promoting and safeguarding the welfare of the fellowship. It was a great privilege for me to serve alongside respected old brothers like Vane Austin, Herbert Harrison, Aaron Linford, Keith Monument, Aaron Morgan, Keith Mundy, John Phillips, Douglas Quay, and Colin Whittaker, as well as younger men like Paul Newbury, Warwick Shenton, and Paul Weaver, who were all newly appointed at the same time as me. Each year the Executive Council elected its own chairman to serve for a year, and in 1987 I was appointed. These elections were always held by secret ballot, and I was surprised to be reappointed year after year for the next 20 years. This obviously gave me added responsibility, especially when it was decided in 1993 to form AoG Inc., which made Executive Council members the sole members of a new charitable company, Assemblies of God Incorporated. The purpose of the company was to protect AoG churches and ministers from any personal liability for actions taken by AoG. This was felt necessary to avoid any crises like the vast debt that had been incurred by the Overseas Missions Council over a situation that had arisen in Paderborn, the details of which I do not need to go into here. The board of directors of this new company was comprised of all members of the Executive Council. As directors, we were given financial responsibility for the affairs of the fellowship, with the safeguard that each director was only personally liable for up to the value of £1. It also gave us legal power over all the assets of the fellowship without reference to the conference. However, as we were appointed by the General Council by being elected to the Executive Council at the General Conference, we were always aware of our responsibility to abide by the wishes of the fellowship as a whole. Despite the legal authority we'd been given, as a matter of integrity, we would never have taken independent action on any major matter without bringing it to the conference. This, as we will see later, was to change in 2007. But now my relationship with the charismatic renewal. My ministry in Britain was by no means confined to AoG. I hadn't grown up in AoG, And ever since I heard about the baptism in the Spirit, my heart has always been for Christians of other denominations to come into the experience. That had been a major part of my ministry when I travelled around the universities in the 60s, preaching and laying hands on people to receive the Spirit. Those were the days when the charismatic renewal was getting underway. And in the 70s, while we were at Basingstoke, I had good fellowship with Barney Coombs, the Spirit-filled pastor of the Baptist Church, who was holding regular ministers' breakfasts and monthly All Saints' nights for Christians of all denominations to hear about the things of the Spirit. So, when early in my time at Mattersey, I received an invitation from Michael Harper to attend something called the Charismatic Leaders Conference at Worlow Grange near Sheffield, I was pleased to accept. It was at these conferences that I met people like Roger and Faith Forster, David Pawson, Terry Virgo, Colin Urquhart, Gerald Coates, and other charismatic leaders. For several years, I was part of the planning committee that organised these conferences, some of which were held at Mattersey. I was also a member of committee that planned the International Charismatic Consultation on Worldwide Evangelisation, ICCOWE, held in Brighton in June 1991. I continued to participate in the conferences throughout and beyond my time at Mattersey, and in fact, at the time of writing this, I'm expecting to attend one this year. I've learnt that although Pentecostals in Britain have been considerably influenced by charismatics, there's still very much that they can learn from us. For example, I'm told by friends and family members that even in flourishing charismatic churches, there is still little clear teaching on the baptism in the Spirit and spiritual gifts. But sadly, the same could be said of some Pentecostal churches. So it became my vision that Mattersey should become more than a college that prepared people to be AoG ministers and missionaries. And we advertised the college as having a distinctly charismatic emphasis. As a result, several of our graduates are now doing a great job for God as Anglican, Baptist or Methodist ministers. It also had the benefit of introducing AoG students at Mattersey to a wider cross-section of the Christian church than just their own denomination. But whether it be in AoG or any other denomination, the fact is that people need teaching. Genuine spiritual experience comes from a correct understanding of biblical truth. That was surely the purpose of a Bible college. And as it's not possible for everyone to come to Bible college, I was determined to make our teaching more readily available to a wider audience. I was able to do this in some measure through articles I contributed to the AoG magazine and Renewal. But in 1998, I had a distinct impression that the Lord wanted me to write more books using the teaching I was giving at Mattersey as a basis. That expanding my writing ministry was the way the Lord was leading me was confirmed in a wonderful way by Cesar Castellanos, who in 1998 was the guest preacher at our AoG conference in Prestatyn. At the end of a late-night meeting where Cesar had been speaking to the members of our Executive Council and their wives, he prayed for each one of us in turn. When he came to me, instead of praying, he prophesied. His prophecy included the following statement: "This is what the Holy Spirit says. I will greatly anoint your pen, and your writing will be a blessing to thousands and thousands of people." Now, that prophecy was remarkable for at least 3 reasons. Firstly, Cesar did not know me. He'd only just met me that evening. Secondly, he knew I was a Christian leader, but he didn't know that I was a writer. And thirdly, as I've said, in the weeks leading up to that conference, I've been feeling that God wanted me to give more time to writing. Cesar's prophecy came as a wonderful confirmation. Since that time, I've written several more books, some of which have been translated into at least 15 different languages. They've certainly reached thousands already. I'm so grateful to the Lord that even while we were still at Mattersey, he was still using me to be a blessing beyond Mattersey, not only in the UK, but much further afield. But that brings me to my ministry in Europe. In an earlier talk, I explained how my ministry in Europe began in the 70s while pastoring the church in Basingstoke. This was as a result of contacts with Willie Drow in Switzerland and George and Warren Flattery, American missionaries working in Belgium. These relationships continued while we were at Mattersey for several years. Eileen and I had led teams of students on missions to Switzerland, and I had regular contact with the Flatteries through the work of ICI, Continental Bible College, and EPTA. Indeed, most of my work in Europe was related to either EPTA, the European Pentecostal Theological Association, or PEF, the Pentecostal European Fellowship. EPTA was formed as a result of the Pentecostal European Conference held in The Hague in August 1978, at which I had been invited to preach. Apart from the main meetings held each morning and evening, there were workshops each afternoon for various special interest groups, including Bible colleges. As the recently appointed principal at Mattersey, I was naturally interested to attend these and found them very helpful. It was good to meet with faculty and staff from other Bible colleges and share what we were doing and what our hopes for the future were. I found myself wondering if it would be possible for us to meet on an annual basis. The PEC conferences were held every 3 years, so it was clear that something separate from PEC needed to be organised, and I suggested this while a few of us were chatting after one of the sessions. As there seemed to be a general agreement about the matter, we decided to look for a suitable venue and dates for the following year. I knew already that the European Pentecostal Fellowship were holding a conference in Vienna in 1979 and suggested that this might be a good time to hold a planning meeting. EPF and PEC were at that time separate bodies, but a few years later merged to form the Pentecostal European Fellowship, about which I'll say more later. So in 1979, Eileen and I, along with several other AoG personnel, attended the EPF conference in Vienna. The meeting with other Bible college people was not an official part of the conference, but was tagged on at the end. However, during the conference itself, I was unexpectedly asked by John Wildrian to be the speaker at one of the sessions, as a brother from France who was scheduled to speak had been unable to come. The subject was spiritual gifts, and fortunately I already had plenty of material on that topic and was grateful for the opportunity to speak to leaders from across Europe on a subject that was close to my heart. The talk was well received, and together with my preaching in The Hague the previous year, proved to be the beginning of a much wider ministry in Europe than I had ever expected. The meeting for Bible college leaders that we had arranged to take place after the conference lasted only a couple of hours, but was a good starting point at which it was agreed to call ourselves EPTA, the European Pentecostal Theological Association. At the invitation of the brothers from ICI, we agreed to hold our first conference the following year in Brussels, where, in addition to hearing papers on subjects of mutual interest, we would discuss a doctrinal statement for EPTA, conditions of membership, and other related matters. The meeting in Brussels was a great success and was the first of many annual gatherings of college personnel from all over Western Europe. And when Eastern Europe opened up after the destruction of the Berlin Wall in 1989, we were delighted to welcome guests from those countries too. Over the years, conferences were held in England, Germany, Belgium, Holland, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Denmark, Switzerland, Poland, Slovakia, France, and Portugal. They were times of great blessing. Despite their name, they were not just an opportunity for theological discussion. Their primary purpose was for colleges to help each other by sharing mutual concerns, many of which had little to do with theology. It was good to know that other colleges faced the same problems as you did. Practical issues like student discipline, catering, timetable, finance, governance, and something which was to be a major topic for several years, accreditation. In addition to all this, there were great times of worship and prayer. Working in a Bible college often means facing stressful challenges, and faculty and staff found EPTA conferences times of refreshing and spiritual renewal. And they were especially relaxing when we held them during the summer vacations, when many combined them with a family holiday. The ones held at Mattersey were particularly popular. Eileen and I formed great relationships with many of our EPTA friends, and trips to EPTA helped forge stronger relationships with our own faculty members too. I remember very well the fun we had when we travelled by minibus to Germany with Dave and Beryl Allen and Brian and Audrey Corr, spending a few days relaxing in Switzerland before staying with friends in Heidenheim in Germany, enabling us to attend the PEF conference near Stuttgart, followed by an EPTA conference in Erzhausen. Much of the blessing we enjoyed at Mattersey sprang from the strength of those relationships. For many years I served on the planning committee for these conferences. In the days before the internet, this necessitated flying to various venues in Europe, most of which I enjoyed immensely, despite the occasional problem with flights, and the anxiety you experience when you don't speak the language and the person you're expecting to pick you up doesn't arrive. The American brother who was picking me up and had mistaken my arrival time at Stuttgart, which was 14:40, as 4:40 in the afternoon. But we learned from these experiences. I don't know he did. And these trips also gave me the opportunity to preach in one of the local churches on Sunday morning before flying back in time for work at Mattersey on Monday. But possibly the most fruitful result of founding EPTA was the openings it gave me to teach and preach in several of its affiliated colleges. I've taught courses both at bachelor's and master's level in Sweden, Finland, Germany, Poland, Denmark, Germany, Portugal, and Ireland. I made several visits to Sweden, where the system was rather different from the other countries I've mentioned. Because of the number of large Pentecostal churches in Sweden, there was no national college, but there were several colleges offering full-time courses based in the local church. The church at Gothenburg, for example, when I preached there, had a Sunday morning congregation of over 2,000 and had a large enough complex to house a full-time Bible college. Stig and Marianne Hedström, who led that college, had brought a party of young people to Mattersey and heard me teach on spiritual gifts, told me that they needed this teaching in Sweden, and asked me if I would come. On 2 separate occasions they organised teaching tours for me, the first starting in Gothenburg on the west coast and travelling across to Stockholm on the east. En route, I visited colleges in Jönköping, Linköping, Mariannelund and Brommaskolan and Kaggeholm, both in Stockholm. On the second tour, about 2 years later, I visited the same places but in reverse order, this time travelling east to west. Some of the other countries I mentioned, Belgium, Finland and Portugal for example, I also visited more frequently after my time at Mattersey, and I'll comment on them in a later talk. But what most of them had in common was the fact that my initial contact with each of them came through EPTA. So whether it was the annual conference, or the trips to help plan them, or teaching in some of its member colleges, EPTA was a source of personal enrichment for me, and I will always be grateful to God for the prompting he gave me to suggest it back in the PEC conference in 1978. Next time, more about PEF and my involvement also with the World Pentecostal Conference. Till then, the Lord bless you.